Hello, I'm Mark Elder, the music director of Manchester's Hallé Orchestra. I thought I would address a topic today that may be slightly surprising, but it's one of the interesting facts about musical taste and musical success, that Antonin Dvořák wrote one of the most famous pieces of symphonic music ever written, more loved than almost any other symphony. And that, of course, is his last symphony, number 9, From the New World. This is a symphony which every orchestra plays, every conductor conducts, and hundreds of thousands of people still enjoy all over the world. But it's his 9th. What about the other 8? What do we know about the other 8? And are they as good? Some of you will know 7 and 8. But what about numbers 1 to 6? I thought it would be interesting and entertaining, perhaps, just to go through these other symphonies and give them some sort of context. If we start at the beginning, I would say that the first 2 symphonies, both written in his 20s, which was a remarkable achievement, and he was very prolific, even at that stage of his life. The first 2 symphonies are not so important. They show us that he had energy, they show us that he could write lovely tunes, and it may be that one movement or another movement is more successful than the rest. But by and large, my feeling is that one should hop over them. One should probably hop over number 4 as well. There's a big debt to Richard Wagner in it, nothing wrong with that, because Dvořák's personality was always coming through. The Hallé hasn't played that 4th symphony for a very, very long time. But there's another one that it hasn't played that I particularly like, and that's number 3. And I would love to find an opportunity to play this in Manchester, in other cities too, because it shows Dvořák's spirit, and it shows his orchestration abilities, and it shows that he was a genuine symphonic composer, even at this age. By now we're in his early 30s. This 3rd symphony in E-flat major has one of the most beautiful openings of any of his works. The way the first tune just sidles into our hearts. Totally characteristic, lovely. Rises up, falls away, and seems to be changing key to the minor mode, and then the tutti comes in and banishes it. Play that first movement a little bit if you can, to get to know it. The piece has been recorded. It's possible to easily hear it online. Unusually, the symphony, number 3, is in 3 movements, not 4. And one of the reasons is that he decided to write a very extended middle movement. Now, this movement is a slow movement. It's very slow, and it's rather funereal in its character. But I wouldn't say that it was a funeral march. I would say it was more solemn, more for a strong ritual, perhaps a national ritual, he was thinking. The parallel musically, as so often with Dvořák, is the influence of Beethoven. And one thinks of the funeral march, the 2nd movement of the Eroica Symphony. The slow trudge of the beat is very beautiful, and it's very beautifully written. It's elegiac, solemn, as I say, and conceived, the architecture of the movement, in a huge long shape. I love it. I think it's very successful. People write to say that you can tell his love of Wagner's opera Tannhäuser. I don't care about that. I don't hear it particularly myself. What I hear is his unmistakable voice, the way he suddenly brings the cellos out and gives them something gorgeous to play, the way the sound of the 2 clarinets, particularly Dvořák's speciality. You see, Dvořák may never have written a very great symphony, as Mahler or Haydn or Bruckner wrote great symphonies. He may have never plumbed the emotional depths in his symphonies, but goodness me, he wrote beautiful music. Music that is easy to enjoy, that is lovely in the deepest, broadest sense of that. And this 2nd movement, at a good flowing tempo, by the way, the slow beat of the music is in the 2 in a bar, not in the 4 in a bar. Makes a very, very lovely impression. It has stateliness in it as well. The music changes key in the middle and goes from C sharp minor to D flat major. And there, it doesn't sound like Wagner to me. Everybody says it sounds like Wagner. It doesn't. To me, it sounds like Smetana, his slightly older contemporary, who was so important in forging the Czech national voice in music. And Smetana's music has great qualities, great charm. It's completely different from Dvořák's. He lacks Dvořák's abundance of melody. This is something that Dvořák shared with Schubert, I think. There's something, in a way, naive and immediate and unforced about his melodies that I think is one of the reasons why his music is still so captivating for audiences everywhere. So this slow movement goes on its way with plenty of variety, plenty of elaboration, and eventually dies away into peacefulness. The third movement, the last movement, is in my view the weakest of the three. It has to go like the wind, and it has to knock away all the dust of the second movement and drive us on. And it does this by a terrific musical imagination, a sense of propelling the music forward, and a return to the original key, E flat major, which is like a slap in the face. It's very hard to play because it's so fast, and it needs a lot of coping with. This is a symphony I would put in the first half of a programme, and then do something much more familiar in the second half. I think it's a lovely idea. It's not so long, but half an hour, just over. But it's full of high spirits, this last movement, full of beautiful writing for the orchestra. And it needs that deftness, that nimble touch that is so attractive in music that is fundamentally based on the dance. So there's a bit of a surprise, isn't it? The third symphony of Dvorak. If we hop over the fourth, we're left with 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9, as you know, is the New World Symphony. And there are 4 others, all of which, in their different ways, I believe should be played regularly and enjoyed. His 5th symphony, in F major, is charming. Not a very popular or usual word nowadays, but charm is a lovely quality in music. It's pastoral, it's bucolic, one could say. Beautifully written for the orchestra. One sees in each of these symphonies his master at the orchestra, getting more subtle and getting more various. So, this F major symphony in 4 movements, right. Charming first movement, full of lovely musical ideas, great emphasis placed, as so often, on the 2 clarinets. The slow movement is what I think of as a Dumke movement, that is to say, music that alternates between the minor key and the major key. In this particular example, we're starting in A minor, not a usual key if the symphony is in F major, and then it dances into A major, and the tempo flows on in the most lovely way. Delicately written, deft touches for the orchestra, beautiful melody. The third movement is joined to the second movement by a little recitative, which is rather nice, it's rather unexpected. It says, we've got to leave this melody we've just had, but let's do it gradually. And again, it's so often the cellos lead us. And when we get back to the key, B flat major he wants, which is a long way from A, there's a little pause, and then with a twinkle, a little wink, the music dashes off into a dance, coloured so often in Dvorak's dance movements by the sound of the triangle tinkling away in the background. I always say it's the phone that nobody answers. It's so well written for the orchestra, and it has the lovely phrases to it, lovely lilt to it. It's irresistible music. The trio too of the scherzo, the middle movement, before we go back and do the scherzo again, is completely irresistible. Things change in the last movement. It's rather dramatic, and you think he's trying to make up for the fact that he's been in such high spirits. And I don't see this as a weakness. The hardest thing in writing a symphony is to write a good finale. We all know that Brahms left it year after year after year, and he was really mature and established in his late 40s, and then he started to write symphonies. Dvorak and Brahms became great friends. Brahms really admired the talent of this young Czech composer. I sense in this last movement him striving to do something artistically more heavyweight. There's a sense of tempestuous temperament in the music, stormy, and I welcome that. I think it's lovely. The musical ideas sometimes are a bit humdrum, the way he treats them, but then out of the blue comes another of these melodies. It's as if he had an endless store packed away in his imagination. And these two things, the charming music and the tempestuous music, fight it out until the end. The trumpets are trumpeting away, giving us fanfares to show us out. It's lovely. Perhaps his first really great symphony is the next one, the sixth one, in D. It's particularly Brahmsian, we could say. Brahms, as you know, wrote a symphony in D as well. And there are reminiscences of Brahms, but just as much of Beethoven. And I don't think this is so often recognised. The first movement of this sixth symphony is in D major, and it's in 3 beats in the bar. It begins with this lovely lilt, gently, smiling and confident, warm, generous above all. But into this easy 3 rhythm, which nearly could be a waltz or a dance. He brings that cross rhythm. Instead of 1, 2, 3, he does 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And where do we find that in Beethoven? Of course, in the first movement of the Eroica, also in 3 beats in a bar. Beethoven's influence was so profound throughout the 19th century. People wanted to somehow live up to him. Why is it that so few composers wrote more than 9 symphonies? Dvorak wasn't the only one. Perhaps they felt they were risking their fate in trying to beat Beethoven at his own game. Such a strange feeling of superstition that, because, as we now know so clearly, when Beethoven wrote his famous 9th symphony, he was at the same time thinking about a 10th. He wasn't finished. But Dvorak's now well on his way, and this 6th symphony is full of enjoyment. So this first movement, although it adds something to Brahms, and I say Beethoven as well, there are so many lovely touches in the music that show his mastery of the orchestra. The way he uses the brass, for instance. He's very clever at getting the trombones to play quiet music, just underneath the texture, giving it a bit of darkness and saving their loud sound for the climaxes. The second movement begins, everybody recognises this, like the beginning of the slow movement of Beethoven's 9th. But this is like homage, it's not imitation. It's a very clever idea to get us into the new key. And the new key gives us a melody that Schubert might have written, perhaps, but is so Dvorak, so loving and so happy. This music is impossible not to enjoy. Skillfully written, and it goes on its way with some drama, some excitement, but then returns to the piece. The scherzo, the third movement, isn't so much a joke. He calls it a furiant, and one of the meanings of furiant is an angry young man, a furiant. And this is a dance with fantastic rhythmic energy. I love it. It's such a successful movement. Once you've heard this symphony, this is the movement you remember, I think. And it has the same quality that I mentioned earlier, that it's a fast tempo, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, da-da, with the cross rhythms that he got from Beethoven perhaps, but he also got from his own national Slavonic music. It has charm in it as well. In the middle of the symphony, everything quietens down, and the piccolo, so rarely given prominence in this sort of music, has a moment of solo quality, so lovely, until the scherzo and the furiant and the angry young man come back and hurl the music to the end. One of the things that makes this a great symphony is that he writes a really good finale. What was a bit of an experiment in the 5th symphony becomes masterful in this 6th symphony. It has such momentum. You know it's going to propel us on the way, and he's totally in command. And the end of this symphony is thrilling. It always gets a wonderful hand, I find, from the audience. When we come to the 7th symphony, we feel that we've gone into another world, that we've reached a mastery. And in choosing this key, D minor, Dvorak shows that he has found some quality that takes us into an emotional depth. And it may be that many of you will remember this symphony and like it and have enjoyed hearing it over the years. It is, of course, a great work, a work full of colours, full of his own voice. By now, I think one can't say that there's any influence from anybody else. It's totally mature Dvorak. And it may be that those of you who've never heard it should give this one a go. Its range of emotion is so strong, deep, dark, not always happy, not always light-hearted, far from it. There's forebodings here. Right from the first note, we feel that we're in a different world. And this sense of musical, emotional adventure is so welcome in these 9 symphonies. And in terms of profundity and some of the harder emotions, some of the more trickier emotions, this is the masterpiece. Its 4 movements are full of contrast. It has a beautiful slow movement, the greatest slow movement he ever wrote, in my view. A terrific scherzo that goes further from the one I've just been mentioning. This is more than an angry young man. This is a whole group of them. It has such energy and such temperament, fire, wonderful writing for the orchestra. One feels that Dvorak here has unleashed something in this symphony that he's headed towards before, but never quite achieved. The finale, perhaps you could criticise for not quite as being effective as the other 3 movements. And it's the way it is handled, I think, makes a great big difference. It has a lot to say. It has a lot of events in it, some wonderful melodies, wonderful musical ideas. But as so often, the development, the working out of them, isn't quite on the top level. But he saves his ace for the end, when he pulls the music on to a great climax, which finishes heroically, with the orchestra giving it all. The next symphony, which is rather unfortunately, in my view, referred to as the English Symphony, or it used to be. That's only because it was first published in London. And he gave it a performance of it when he went to Cambridge to get his doctorate of music. And its association at the beginning of its life was with our country. And it was published by Novellos in London. But it is the most Czech of them all. It is a supreme masterpiece, but a very original one. It does not conform to all the rules. And I'm sure this popular work will be familiar to many of you. But for those of you who've never heard it, it's one to really look forward to. If you enjoy the New World Symphony, you will surely enjoy this. So skillfully written, with such life in it, so many melodies, so many examples of his particular vitality. Birdsong, I would say, plays a big role. Near the beginning, you hear the flute, and it sounds like a dawn, the beginning of the bird song in the morning. It's lovely. But there's an elegiac quality to it too. There's drama in it, there's contrast and resolution. His mastery as a symphonic writer is at full pelt. The slow movement, one of his greatest creations. So full of incident, activity. What's going on in his mind? It seems rather elegiac, very expressive at the beginning, but something changes and there's something of the village life. Dvorak, you could say in many ways, was, even at the end of his life, a peasant. He came from peasant stock. He was in touch with village life, with the legacy of Czech music. And this charming music that comes seems to be celebrating that background. The slow movement is my favourite movement of this symphony. It's not a scherzo like An Angry Young Man. Far from it. It's an elegant waltz, very feminine and elegant and phrased and shaped, in a minor key. But it has its own quality that is in none other symphony. And in the middle, the music changes, what we call the trio of the scherzo, which means really the middle section that is supposed to be a beautiful contrast. And here he picks out of his bag, like a golfer on the golf course, wondering what club do I need for this stroke? And he gives us a tune that once you've heard it, you never forget it. It's a tune to go home whistling. Repeated a few times by the orchestra, each time scored differently, different sound world. Until the end, the violins play it with those little scoops, those little portamenti in the sound that are so nostalgic, so affectionate. The last movement starts boldly with a trumpet fanfare. And the great Czech conductor Raphael Kubelik apparently once said to a German orchestra, "Gentlemen, in my country, the trumpets sound the invitation to dance, not to fight. That's what you should remember." It's a call to enjoyment, a call to bring the village together. And he writes a series of variations on this lovely tune in the cellos. And it's full of variety, full of drama, storminess. Some people say it's a bit noisy. I don't think it's noisy. You have to make sure it's played well. You have to have the right tempi, not too pell-mell, so that you can hear all the notes. And it finishes more and more quietly, diminuending right away into nothing, until the last tutti shows us the door. Wonderful piece. So finally, we get to the New World Symphony. This is a symphony written to his countrymen from the New World. This is something that's so easily forgotten. Dvorak was invited to go and live in New York, to run the Conservatory of Music there. And when he got there, he was begged to help the American people find their own music. Why did they always have to go back to Europe before they wrote a symphony, before they wrote anything? Couldn't they find there in America the material that they needed to make an American voice? And he said yes. He believed that the African American music had so much beauty in their tunes, so much variety, so much depth of emotion, that he's sure that everybody could find some way into it. And he showed them by planning an opera. This is very rarely emphasized, I find. He planned a story on Hiawatha, this very famous American poem by Longfellow. And he really was absorbed by the topic. And it's clear that some of the music of the New World Symphony came from this opera. He never finished it, it never quite got off the ground, but he went some way into writing it. And we know from what he said that certain parts of this famous symphony were actually inspired by the words and were perhaps going to be scenes in the opera. Perhaps we'll never know. But it does help to know something about this Hiawatha background. And in fact, I have done some performances when somebody reads extracts from the poem just before we do each movement. But this symphony, so famous in its tunes, so famous in its dramatic impact, is technically not his greatest symphony. And it's fascinating to me that it's become so popular and so appreciated by so many music lovers all over the world. And I think this is because of the tunes themselves. The quality of the melodies are still so evocative and so memorable. The way that the symphony starts is interesting, isn't it? Do you remember? It starts as quietly as we can play it. And I always think of it like an old nurse saying to a child, I remember long ago, I could tell you some stories, my dear. And the nurse, goes on to tell stories, perhaps of Hiawatha, who knows, perhaps of American folklore. It's a lovely way, it steals in on our ears. Well, this symphony needs really no introduction, apart from the Hiawatha bits. And I think that its popularity will never go. It remains fresh. I find I love still performing it, however many times I've done it. You can't avoid it making its impact. He brings the tunes in the second and third and fourth movement, he brings the tunes back from previous movements until the end of the last movement. You have a sort of a memory lane of all the tunes in the other movements. But he does this so skillfully, I don't think it disturbs. The slow movement, remember, has that lovely solemn opening that leads into this famous cor anglais solo, which I believe should not be played too slowly. It shouldn't be mawkish, shouldn't be sentimental. It should be a tune that you used to know as a child and you've just forgotten the words. All the movements of this symphony have a great strong character, and those of you who know it will know what I mean. But it still has a great place in our hearts. I shall never forget once I had the most extraordinary experience conducting it. It's a symphony I know very well. I was conducting it in St. Paul in Minnesota one morning. Packed house, I remember. It's a symphony I do from memory, so there was no score, there was no stand. And I started the last movement, which is, if you remember, very dramatic, before it brings in this famous tune. And I started it, and after about, a bar and a half, I suddenly became aware that in my hand, all I had got was the handle of my baton. and I had no idea where the rest of the baton was. How it happened, I shall never know. But my baton broke in mid-air just by the gesture that I made, and a second or two later it landed on a young violinist just sitting on my left, landed on his head and made him jump out of his skin. And I thought, how embarrassing, and I didn't know what to do with just the handle. Can't remember what I did. I think I got rid of it somehow. But at the end of the performance, there was a knock on my dressing room door. And there was this young man. And I said, look, I must apologise. I have no idea how that accident happened. I couldn't see anything, and suddenly I saw my baton land on your head. I do apologise. He wasn't upset at all. He wasn't cross with me at all. In fact, he was rather thrilled that it had happened to him. And he said, Maestro, I just thought, no, it's fine. He said, I just wonder, have you got the rest of it? Could I take the whole thing? So I gave him the handle, and off he went as happy as Larry. So these things happen. You never know when they're going to happen. So there we have 9 symphonies by a great composer. Not the greatest symphonies ever written, but music so enjoyable, so skillfully written, and in those last 5, something special.